All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this third town hall that we're doing for the federal election for Everybody's Home. For those who don't know me, my name is Maiy Azize. I'm the national spokesperson for the Everybody's Home campaign, and I'm also the Deputy CEO of Anglicare Australia. I want to kick off by acknowledging the Yagara and Turrbal people, who are the traditional owners of the lands that Stephen is joining us from, and that many of you will be joining us from in the electorate of Brisbane. I'll also acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people from Canberra, where I'm joining you all from. And I think it's important when we're talking about housing and how we're all organising ourselves to acknowledge that we are on country that's been stolen and that nobody is hurting more as a result of our housing crisis than First Nations people. So what we're going to do today is we'll hear a little bit from Joel, who's the CEO of Better Renting, about some of the things that renters are seeing on the ground in Brisbane. We'll hear a bit from Stephen about some of his and the Greens plans for how to tackle Australia's housing crisis. We'll ask a few questions on behalf of the campaign, and then we'll go into some audience questions. So if any of you have got any questions that you want to put to Stephen and Joel, just pop them in the chat, the Q&A, I should say. We'll be keeping an eye on that, and that'll be a bit easier than if you try to raise your hand. We may not be able to get to everybody that way. So it's very expensive to rent in Australia. Everybody's Home has just got a report out this morning showing that you would need to be earning about 100,000 to about 130,000, depending on where in the country you are, to clear 30% of your income being spent on rent, looking at asking rents and incomes around the country, which is pretty phenomenal. So you need to be bringing in 6 figures to be able to comfortably afford the rent in Australia. And that tells us a lot about why so many people are delaying big life choices like moving out of home. It tells us a lot about why so many people are share housing until a lot later in life than they expected to, and why people are doing things like putting off maybe having children because they just can't afford a stable home. So those are some of the things that are at stake in this conversation and some of the things that we're going to be talking about. And Joel, I might throw to you first. You're the CEO of Better Renting. Can you walk us through some of the things that you're seeing, some of the things that you're hearing from renters on the ground, especially in Brisbane, which we know is a pretty expensive place to live?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Maiy. And hello, everyone. Pleasure to be here talking about rental issues in relation to, I think, a really important area. So yeah, I'll speak a bit about some of the issues we've been hearing from on the ground in response to the question. I guess one I think that is really central, perhaps over the last couple of years, has been affordability. And I think I sort of want to highlight this. This has been an issue across the country, but Better Renting did a survey of renters, our cost of renting survey last year, and Queensland really stood out as an area where the median proposed rent increase was higher than elsewhere in the country. So on average, it was about 11% rent increases, which is still pretty gobsmacking. But we were seeing from Queensland respondents, the vast majority of whom would have been around Brisbane, that they were looking at rent increases of about 14%. And also more renters in Queensland actually getting rent increases. So about 4 in 5 people said that they've got a rent increase compared to a slightly lower rate elsewhere in the country. I think that affordability impact, it flows through in a couple of ways to really, I guess, hear from renters when I speak to them. So one is you might be in a rental and you get a rent increase, and it's actually so expensive that you're forced to move out. And so that might be someone that has to move further away from where they live and work. It might be them having to move to lower quality accommodation. It can really sort of end up with that person having to make a lot of housing sacrifices, selling to lower quality accommodation. Alternatively, the person might stay in the property, but then they've got to deal with this bigger rent increase. Another thing we're hearing from a lot of renters about is having to give up on, sometimes essentials, sometimes cutting back on grocery shopping, but certainly a lot of times being able to give back on anything that makes life pleasant or worthwhile or enjoyable, which I think is also a problem when we're talking about renting. I guess the other dimension, though, is people who maybe haven't necessarily got that rent increase, but they're worried about getting that rent increase. And I think that fear has been really pervasive over the last couple of years. And so what that leads to is when people are in a property, they feel much less comfortable about speaking up and exercising their rights because of that worry about retaliation, which could be through an unfair eviction or through a rent increase. So when people know that the market's much tighter, it'll be harder for them to find a place that they're forced to move out, then they're going to put up with conditions in their current home that they wouldn't otherwise put up with, which might be getting the oven fixed. It might be having a place that's livable in summer. All those little negotiations that are really important for renters' experiences, but where when the market's tight, when you do see big rent increases, renters are really worried and unable to speak up on those sorts of issues.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joel. That's a really interesting and not hugely surprising to me, and really consistent with some of the things that we've found in our priced out report, which came out today. If you're on a median income, which is about $72,000 in Brisbane, you're spending more than half of your income on rent. And if you're on 130,000, which is I think we can all agree a pretty high income, you're still spending more than 30% of your income on rent for the average rent in Brisbane. So it's a pretty expensive place to live. So Stephen, I'm going to throw to you now. I think you've seen our election roadmap for everybody's home. We're really interested in what you're seeing on the ground from some of your constituents. What are some of the things that people are talking to you about, and what are the Greens' plans for tackling the housing crisis?
Thank you. And thanks for having me. And thanks for hosting this forum, actually. I think this is an issue that is impacting so many people, either personally or in their immediate circle of friends or family. Like no one is free from the housing crisis that we're facing in this country at the moment. And like you've already noted as well, and Joel had as well, in Brisbane in particular, it's really, really being felt quite acutely. In my electorate, we have well over 50% of the constituents are renters. So there's a lot of people in my community who are being really, really severely impacted by this. And we see it manifest in so many different ways as well. So like for our electorate office here in Albion, we will have people come in who are living out of their cars with their kids. And these are sort of people on, like you're saying, like sort of the median wage, like public servants who are now in this position where they can't afford the rent or their mortgage repayments because things have gone up so exponentially and so quickly as well in such quick succession. So I really think that we're facing this sort of existential crisis, but it's not something that I think has just come out of nowhere. It's something that has been building for decades now from, I would say, we can sort of trace a lot of it back to the sort of the slowdown in the build of public housing. We can trace a lot of it back to the tax reforms that were brought in under the Howard government, negative gearing, capital gains tax discounts, that have sort of created this housing sector that is built around, I would say, financialization and commodification. So we've sort of transformed the idea of a house to be somewhere that you live and that a home and that you would raise your family to be something that should be speculated on and bought and sold and just an investment class is what I'm trying to say. And I think that to solve the housing crisis, that is the big meta problem that we actually have to fix. And so I think that is something obviously better renting and everybody's home sort of identified in their election roadmap when you're talking about, phasing out negative gearing and reforming the capital gains tax discount. 100%, those are policies that we've taken to previous elections and will be taking to this election as well. For people who don't know, negative gearing, or the amount of money in sort of these tax breaks that the government spends is around about $176 billion. That is a lot of money that is being essentially given out as a handout. We should be using that money, and what our platform is this election is taking that money and establishing a public property developer, someone that can actually build more public homes and sell them at cost and rent them at 25% of a person's income, basically, so that we can put this floor in the housing market. Because we can't just have prices spiraling up and up and up and up forever and ever and ever. It's not sustainable, not for housing, and it's not sustainable in the broader economy. Something that I think is lost in a lot of this debate in the with a lot of politicians is that the housing market is actually part of the economy and functions with it, not as this sort of weird entity that operates outside of it. So when you have people spending, like you said, 50% of their income on their rent, if rents keep going up and house prices keep going up and we're spending 60, 70, 80, 90% of our income on rent, that is money that cannot be spent in the private economy anymore. When that happens, businesses start going out of business, people lose their jobs, and then no one can afford housing anymore, and then the bubble bursts. And I speak of this from experience. I grew up in the UK, and my sort of becoming aware of the world, I was at the age of 2008, where the global financial crisis was happening. And I can't think of a better way of phrasing it, so pardon the term, but the arse fell out of the whole economy and the housing market. And what that meant was our family home that we'd lived in lost, would have been the equivalent of about $300,000 of value in a month. We had people who were going into negative equity in our street. Everyone was having to sell. The entire economy came to a grinding halt. And that bubble was burst because of the subprime mortgage crisis, but I see a bubble that has formed and is just getting bigger and bigger here. And if we don't let the air out of it slowly with some of these reforms to negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount and the building of more public homes and getting some rent control in as well, like we see it work in the ACT and in other countries around the world, we need a national approach for that. If we don't let the air out of the bubble with those measures, I don't want to think about what the alternative is, because that will hurt so many more people for such a much more extended period of time. But I don't want it to all be doom and gloom. We have the benefit in this country of being, for better or worse, about 10 years behind the US and the UK. So I think, we can either be a deer in headlights and just stand and watch the problem hurtle towards us, or we can actually be bold and brave and take the steps to get out of the way. And I think that we have the capacity, and we have the ability, and we have the expertise and the skills to actually get out of the way.
Yeah, thanks for that, Stephen. And to build on what you said, we did some polling in Brisbane and a couple of other key seats at, last month, and a vast majority of people who we polled think that the fairest way to spend money on housing is to build housing instead of giving it to investors in the form of tax breaks. And I think one of the things that's really underappreciated in our debate is actually that the government is spending billions of dollars on housing. It's spending it lining the pockets of people who invest in housing instead of providing housing to people. I can already see that there are some really great questions coming through, so I do want to get to them. But I have a couple from the campaign first before we turn to audience questions. I want to start by kind of reflecting on what the federal government and the opposition are doing and are proposing to do about housing. In 2023, Parliament passed Labor's flagship Housing Australia Future Fund, and in 2024, the Help to Buy scheme. The opposition's flagship election commitment is superannuation for housing, where people can access some of their super balance and put it towards a home deposit. What are your thoughts on those approaches? Do they go far enough? And how would you engage with those approaches in the next term of Parliament?
Is that one for me first, or Joel?
Yeah, that's one for you, actually. I'll start with you and then maybe Joel.
Yeah, sure. I think we came into this Parliament with probably the most amount of political and social capital of government. Oh, sorry, all the lights in my office just went out. I hope people can still see me. I'll turn my brightness up. The most amount of sort of political and social capital that we'd had in politics in this country for a long time. And it was a great reason to do something huge and bold. I would not say that the Housing Australia Future Fund was a bold policy when it was first introduced into Parliament. It came into the Parliament as, it was sort of sold as this $10 billion investment, but that $10 billion wasn't accessible straight off the bat. It was actually capped at $500 million every year. And that was the maximum the government would allow itself to spend on building housing. So it could be anywhere between $0 and $500 million. It was basically the money or the dollar value that could have been spent was a result of the return that the $10 billion was making on the Future Fund. So if the Housing Australia Future Fund had been passed the previous year, the result on the Future Fund was actually a negative. So in theory, no money would have been spent on building housing in that year of Parliament. So through a lot of negotiations with the government, between the government and us and the Greens, we were able to basically change that bill so that that $500 million became a minimum investment every single year, and that it was also indexed every single year. And we also got the government to invest directly in building housing. So instead of having to wait for the return on the fund to occur before they could spend money, we were able to get them to spend $3 billion on social and public housing across the entire country. So while I think it was great that we were able to get that outcome, I was disappointed that that was sort of the grand vision that we were going into this with. But also not entirely surprised. I love to sort of zoom out of all these problems because I think it really helps understand where governments are coming from. And so we sort of have this economic system at the moment where governments don't really believe it is their role to be directly involved in the provision of housing and the building of housing, among a lot of other different public services. And I think that's why we don't see these sort of big programs that we may have used to have seen in the past, like post-World War II, or that we maybe see in Europe, like in more recent times as well. I look at one example that I really, really like and talked about a lot during the Housing Australia Future Fund negotiations was Sweden's Million program, which they did during the 80s, which, if you can believe it, they committed to building 1 million public homes within a decade, and they achieved it. They actually exceeded it by a couple of hundred. And that's sort of, I feel like that's the sort of bold vision that we need to try and go for, because those things are achievable. It's just about having the political will to get it done. And so I think, you know, part of the platform we're taking this election is, yes, the public property developer, sort of in the a la the Swedish program that happened, to try and build as many public homes as we possibly can to, again, provide that floor in the market for people to be able to get into. And then you talked a bit about the LNP's policy. It's sort of an interesting one, because I can kind of get the appeal of it, especially for young people. You know, as a young, I think I can call myself a young person still, young person myself, and someone who does rent still. I get why some people might be drawn to it, but the thing that really concerns me about it is I feel it's very much cutting off your nose to spite your face. Yes, you might be able to have this more amount of money for a housing deposit now, but it has the potential to completely screw up your retirement. You know, you'd be losing so much out of your super as it continues to invest throughout your whole working life. And I don't think encouraging people to just take on more and more and more and more and more debt is actually the solution to the housing crisis. And actually, it isn't the solution to the housing crisis, because that is what caused the global financial crisis in 2008, was excessive amounts of debt and mortgages. So I think, you know, like I said, we've seen that path not work already. I think we should avoid that and try and actually invest in programs and conduct programs that we know have worked, because we've seen them work in this country and around the world previously.
Thanks for that, Stephen. I'm keen, Joel, to hear your reflections on that as well. We didn't get a ton of time there to go into super for housing, but I wonder if you've got thoughts on that too.
Yeah, and I think Steve actually put it really well. You can sort of see the superficial appeal of this. And you know, I think it does, maybe on the surface of it, seem like an appealing idea. I think people have this sort of experience or idea of, oh, I'm going to go along to a housing auction and I'm going to have an extra $20,000 in my pocket, so I'll win the property. But if you think a little more, like, oh, but they also each have an extra $20,000 in their pocket, so we'll all just bet $20,000 more. And then the owner sells the property for more than they would have otherwise. And the person who gets the property is a person who has been on a higher income than me and has more in their super. And so I think yeah. Look, I think yes, it seems good on the surface. I think the Liberals, to understand this policy, you have to think about where the Liberals are coming from and what they're actually trying to do. The Liberals face an electorate that has a growing appetite for action on housing affordability, and where there's now a national recognition this is a problem. They can't pretend that there's not a problem here. They actually need to be putting up with something. At the same time, their core constituency is people who own property and want those property values to go up. So this puts the Liberals in a bit of a bind, and the best policy solution for them is a thing that seems to improve housing affordability, but actually makes property prices go up. And I think that if you look at it that way, it really explains the current policy, because that's basically what it would do. It's something that makes people feel like they'll be able to afford a home. But then it is a demand side subsidy. It is putting more money in the hands of buyers, and this is going to push house prices up. And I really had hoped that governments had moved on from this sort of thing. I think we have actually seen governments moving on. The Productivity Commission has been really critical of this sort of approach that basically does just benefit existing owners. And I think that is largely what the effect would be. I'm probably a bit less concerned about the impact on retirement savings, and more just the fact that it will make house prices more expensive in the immediate term. But I think it is also true that you're saying to people, take your retirement savings and use those to make a leveraged investment in real estate. And, you know, if prices of property keep going up, that'll work out for you. But if it goes down, you're actually a little bit screwed. And it doesn't really make sense to encourage people to do that if also you're saying we're going to try to make housing more affordable by reducing prices. So yeah, it's quite incoherent. I will also say, I think the super for housing also reflects this mentality that we are really keen at better renting to speak out against, where the solution for renting being bad is to own your own home. And I really would love to see, certainly, you know, from all over the parliament, certainly from the Liberals, more of a recognition that there's a growing number of people who are renting and are renting long term. And we should say, how can we make renting better? Not just how can we stop people being renters? And I certainly hear from a lot of renters who are pretty fed up with this attitude of, oh, you're renting sucks. Why don't you stop renting?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that actually touches on a couple of the comments and the questions that we're getting, and one of the things I was keen to ask you about. The most common piece of feedback that came to everybody's home last year when we ran a People's Commission. We ran a People's Commission into Australia's housing crisis. We heard from renters who were forced to move out repeatedly because they couldn't afford rent increases. And we do have a question in here from, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this correctly, Stefano, about landlords and real estate agents justifying rent increases, often citing market values. What are some of the things that can be done to limit rent increases? We had at one of our previous town halls talked about the Better Deal for Renters framework that came through from National Cabinet, which limited how often rent increases can come through, but not the size of them. And there's also a question here from Stefano about should the government have a role in defining and regulating annual rent increases. I might start with Joel first for this one.
Yeah, thank you. I might start with the Better Deal for Renters package that you mentioned, Maiy. So for people who might have forgotten about this, I think it happened about August 2023 through National Cabinet, and all the governments got together and said, we're going to come up and do a bit more on renting issues. And at the time, I was fairly skeptical, and it seemed pretty milquetoast. It still was fairly milquetoast, but I guess what have been happy to see is like they actually have gone and done by and large the things that they said they would do. Not every government has done everything, but since those commitments were made, a lot of governments have moved on various parts that were in the Better Deal for Renters package. And I think it is actually a really good template that we should celebrate and say this demonstrates that the Commonwealth can play a role in this issue, and we want to see more like this going further. But I think it was actually quite almost a watershed moment for the Commonwealth stepping into rental issues. But as you say, limiting the frequency of rent increases without limiting the actual amount of rent increases really is not going far enough. And at the same time, limiting evictions, which we have seen some action on to say you can't end a tenancy for no reason, but still allowing unrestricted rent increases also doesn't actually give people security or stability in their home, because they always have that risk of being pushed out by a rent increase. So I think what we are keen to see is like governments can intervene and try to change the market conditions and get more supply of housing and rental options out there. And that does mean there's less upward pressure on rents. At the same time, you can intervene and say, let's also try to regulate those rent increases. I think the model here in the ACT is a really good model that other jurisdictions should be learning from, which I think of almost as like a rent stabilization system, because what it does is it says the rent can go up year to year, but we're going to have a little bit of moderation in that. And so it's tied to the consumer price index for rents in the ACT, which does mean it can sort of be a bit feeding on itself. And I think you could change that. But I think the fundamental model that says there'll be some sort of percentage threshold, and that's the default threshold for a rent increase. If the landlord wants to go above that, then you'll need to apply to a tribunal to sign off on it. And that's the model, what's roughly the model in the ACT. And I think it is actually just shifting the norm, setting a threshold, still allowing a bigger rent increase where either the tenant agrees or the tribunal signs off on it. That has made a big difference for renters in the ACT.
Yeah, thanks for that, Joel. And keen to hear your thoughts on that, Stephen. Yeah, and Stefano's question was, should the government have a role in regulating rent increases, especially when they far outpace income growth?
Yeah, 100%. And I think Joel's point is really, really important, actually, and not something that I thought of before, and that it was kind of a watershed moment when the federal government decided that it kind of had to be involved in sort of regulation of rents. Like previously, it's been a very sort of hands-off, not our problem, and approach, and we'll just leave it all to the states. But I think that, yeah, it sort of showed in that National Cabinet meeting that, oh, this is actually something that you could do, and this is actually something that you could be involved in. And I think that it's kind of inevitable that it is going to happen, because I think the public is demanding that it does happen. And the longer that the federal government doesn't do anything about it, the angrier people get and the more people want them to step into the space. I mean, like we've been calling for basically rent control similar to what they have in the ACT for a few years now, particularly around the emergency rent freeze, and then the capping of the increase of rents year on year after that. And I think it's sort of like I've sort of been talking about, it's about moving away from this idea that a house is actually this speculative investment that you're entitled to make a profit on, because in no other industry is there this entitlement that I must make a positive return on my investment. Investments can be gambles. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And I think that the right of people to have shelter and the right of people to have a home and a roof over their head trumps the entitlement to make a profit. And I think that's why we need to sort of change this mindset and have things like rent controls and national standards for renters, because these are people's homes that they are living in, and they have a right to be safe in them and financially secure in them and to have minimum standards in them. And I don't think that's a controversial thing to be asking for. It's sort of, I would say, a sort of basic necessity in 2025 that people have access to safe, secure housing, and not the threat of being evicted at a random whim. And so I think it is good that we've seen some progress on this around the country, but yes, 100% the federal government should have a role in this space. And the more the public demands that they have a role in this space, the more likely it is actually that the federal government is going to step into this space.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think you've both touched, and especially you, Stephen, have on housing as an investment vehicle, and you've mentioned a few times the tax concessions that are available to investors. Our People's Commission last year heard evidence about how tax concessions for investors are pushing up housing costs, and we've also heard the government ruling out doing anything about that. We've got a question in the chat from Melissa about what's a good way to get people on board with phasing out these tax breaks when we're talking to people, because it's also a key plank of our campaign.
Happy for me to go first? That is a really, really good question. And the way I kind of frame it to people is sort of already how I did a little bit earlier in this forum, and obviously sort of using your own personal anecdotes, but I find the example of what happened in the UK is very compelling for people. You know, no one wants to see really the value of their home diminished by $300,000 in a month. That benefits no one. So I think what we need to really come at this from an angle of I think there are two ways the housing crisis ends. And it either ends with us letting the air out of this bubble slowly through these regulations and through reforming the tax system, or it all just falls apart around us and like ripples out into the broader economy. Those are the two options that we are faced with. I don't think there is a secret third option where everything is like sunshine and rainbows. I think those are the two options. Those are the two paths, and we have to choose which one we want to take. And the path that I think we should take is reforming the tax system, like I've said, with negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount and phasing them out. I think we have to build public housing, get rent control in place, and a national renter standards. Because I think if we don't do that, we're just, like I said before, we're just a deer in headlights, waiting for the crisis to get worse and waiting for the bubble to burst. And so I think that is sort of having those frank conversations with people, like Melissa said, with landlords, and trying to get people more on side. That is the cold, hard reality of the situation that we will face. It's not an if, it is a will. And if landlords want to be able to keep having their properties or whatever it may be, they're going to have to accept some form of regulation and some sort of reform, because if they don't, I don't know what will happen. People, I think, have an inherent level of dignity. And if they're spending 80-90% of their income on their rent, and people get locked out of the housing market, and we end up with generations, plural, of people that can never get into their own home or never get into their own house, they are going to have no faith in the economic system and have no stake in maintaining the status quo. And that is going to be worse in the long term for these huge property developers and huge property investors than accepting these, I think, quite considered and quite reasonable reforms.
Yeah, Joel, and I'm keen to hear from you as well. I know you've done some thinking about how we communicate and persuade people about housing issues. We've also got a comment from Scott about how much the debate about CGT and also negative gearing has kind of retreated in recent times. What are your thoughts on some of this?
Yeah, thank you, Maiy. I've got a couple of thoughts. I think what's probably really important to just at a bottom line keep track of, because there's a bit of debate about there about how much impact these concessions actually have on the housing market. But everyone agrees that they make house prices higher than they would otherwise be, and everyone agrees that they cost the budget billions of dollars. So as a starting point, if we didn't have these settings in place and someone put their hand and said, we've got a housing crisis, how about the government spends billions of dollars to make housing more expensive? They would get laughed out of the room. But yet, just because it happens to be the status quo, it's it's a status quo and doesn't get questioned that way. So as a starting point, I don't think anyone can really mount a strong defense of the status quo against that bottom line. Thinking more specifically, I guess, about the communications challenge here, I do think it's important to recognize that most people don't own investment properties. About 14%, I think, of people, or 1 in 7, do have investment properties. But really, the much bigger constituency here is people who own property. And many of them do think of it as an investment too. And that's about 2/3 of people who either are owner-occupiers with a mortgage or owner-occupiers without a mortgage. And I think there's a bit of a rhetorical shift maybe where those people sort of identify with landlords, and many of them are also landlords, because like, oh, like we're all owning properties. And I think what renters need to be thinking about is building common ground with owner-occupiers on the lens of we all want to use our house as a home. Landlords are actually the weird ones. They're the ones who are buying properties that they don't live in. They're not raising their children in. They're not like having a nice house party. Renters and owner occupiers have this common ground of like, oh, like housing should be about a home. And although when people buy properties as a like to live in, they certainly think about the capital gains. No one's blind to that, but it is ultimately their home. And I think they think out in those terms. So I think there's some common ground there. I guess part of what this is also about is talking to those people about what things like these tax concessions mean for them. I think a really important concept for people to get their head around is if you are going to buy property in the future, even if you own a property now, you're basically neutral with respect to housing prices. You might think you want them to go up. Your current house goes up, but so does the house you want to buy. Really, house prices increasing is only good for people who own multiple properties or who aren't going to be buying another property in the future. So it's very much weighted towards the wealthiest people and older people. If you've just bought your first home, yes, you like don't want that house value to go down realistically, but you're going to be buying another home in the future. And it probably is actually at least neutral for you for that to happen. And maybe one other important thing for the communications is it's not very appealing just to be like, we're going to save the budget billions of dollars, because then there's a question like, well, what are we actually doing with it? And I do think saying, instead of spending money doing bad thing X, we're going to spend money doing good thing Y is probably a really good way to actually talk up tangible benefits to a reform here. And I guess that might be a public housing developer that's building housing. It might be, certainly I think government directly playing a role in increasing the supply of public housing is a really appealing thing that clearly solves a problem in a way that landlord welfare doesn't.
It's actually quite interesting. There's been some research by the Centre for Equitable Housing, and they have looked at landlord sentiment and found that people who have one investment property actually have fairly indistinguishable views from people who don't invest in property at all and are actually pretty open to some of these tax changes that you're talking about. There's a question that we've got from Rosalind about Airbnb and stays and the role that it's playing in the current housing crisis and what can be done about that. I might start with Stephen on that one. And I think I would note, Rosalind, that those tax breaks that we've been talking about are available to people who list on Airbnb and stays, as well as people who list rentals. So it's an interesting place to start.
It took the answer right out of my mouth. That's exactly what I was going to say. I think obviously there's those federal levers that you've got, like with tax reform, like we've been talking about. We actually had a policy that we took to our local government election here in Brisbane, which was dramatically increasing the rates on properties that were Airbnbs to try and disincentivize people from turning those properties into Airbnbs, because it's actually quite a substantial problem we have here in Brisbane, is people buying up properties and then turning them into short stay accommodation and not long-term rentals. So it's actually making the housing crisis even worse for people up here. But I think definitely, I think this will, at least the federal sort of answer to that problem is 100% reforming the tax system and phasing out negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. Because like I've said a few times, it's sort of that decommodification of housing and changing it from being seen as a speculative investment and something that you will just buy to add to your portfolio, and turning it back into the idea that it is first and foremost a home for people to live in. And I think that, Joel's point as well, I thought on the previous answer was really, really good. So I have no idea why my lights keep turning on and off, but maybe it's haunted. Yes, actually having something positive to sell, for lack of a better phrase, with the savings from, reforming the tax system. $176 billion over the decade is a lot of money that could go to a lot of different things, not just housing, but like dental into Medicare, mental health supports, loads of different things that the government could spend money on to actually improve people's lives. And so when I think we're talking about communications, it's good to show the savings and the dollar value of that, but people, I think, really also want to know what we're investing in, what we're using that money to invest in, and how it's actually going to make people's lives better. And so I think when we talk about negative gearing and capital gains, maybe coming at it from this angle of Airbnb and stays, like Rosalind has mentioned, and saying, yes, it will help to address that and reduce the amount of people getting into the market for that purpose. And in exchange, we can use this money to do X, Y, Z that will actually make your life better, make housing more affordable, and reduce the cost of living and save the planet at the same time. Because all those things are not mutually exclusive. And I would actually argue are inextricably linked, and we have to do all three to be able to save just one of them. So I hope that answers the question.
Joel, have you got anything to add on that?
Yeah, look, I'll just add briefly, I think, what you touched on about the landlord welfare, Maiy, that I think there's something very sneaky going on, because people sort of argue in favor of things like negative gearing on the basis that landlords are providing rental housing, which I think is a pretty bogus argument. But it's particularly bogus when the person does actually put that property in the long-term rental market. So I think there is, to some extent, this sort of implied social contract of we are giving this tax concession on the expectation that there's at least some sort of service being provided in the community. And I think for someone to be tapping into that and then, basically not providing housing in the community for people who are living in that community, it really is trying to like have your cake and eat it too. And I think there's certainly a lot of scope to look at, the impacts of the negative externalities of things like Airbnb and stays, and try to like better balance that economic model so that, we can not necessarily like completely ban it outright, but say, what are the harms here? How can we counterbalance those harms, and also like try to achieve the social good, which might just be through, raising some revenue from or whatever it may be.
Fantastic. This has been a fantastic conversation. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and I'm so sorry that there's going to be a bunch of questions from the audience that we didn't get to. But I do want to finish on a question about political realities and how we can make change. I'm going to start with Joel, then maybe give the last word to Stephen. Some of the changes that our campaign asks for are pretty big. And, a lot of the things we've talked about today are pretty big, and we often get told that there isn't the political appetite for the things that we want. What needs to happen from a campaign like us to build support for bigger and more ambitious changes?
Great. Thank you, Maiy. I'm sort of speaking as someone who is also in the nonprofit sector and sort of, alongside Everybody's Home and Anglicare Australia. I think I'll offer two reflections. I think at the level of organisations, I think more organisations need to be willing to basically get their hands dirty in the world of electoral politics. I think there's sometimes this attitude of sort of like, oh, we can't go there, we can't touch that. And people are a little bit almost hoity-toity about not wanting to engage with it. I think there are some reasonable questions to ask. Like, there are some legal limitations that you can do, and you might be working with a constituency who would genuinely feel like quite upset, depending on sort of how you approach that. But I do think there's actually like just a level of integrity of being able to say to the public, like, these are the issues we care about, and this is what things are going on around those issues. And I think that's the very least something I think I'm quite conscious that Better Renting sort of owes to our community, to let them know what's out there on rental issues. I guess also, what helps to build bigger, more ambitious changes and support for them is something I guess I want to aim at the participants here, is having people who, if you do care about these issues, doing whatever you can to elevate them as political issues. And that might be, if there are candidates for the election, having a coffee meeting down at your local cafe, going to them and bringing up this issue with them so that they hear about. I remember someone telling me, would have been a couple of elections ago, how they were volunteering with Labor, and people are constantly like basically coming up to the candidate and yelling at them about the position on negative gearing. And we actually sort of want a case where Labor's getting yelled at because of their inaction on negative gearing, and Liberal candidates are getting yelled at, and other people are getting like, bought chocolate bars because of their action, the good stuff that they're doing on housing issues. So I do think like basically the people who are benefiting from the status quo feel really entitled to the status quo, and anytime people try to take it away, they get completely up in arms to defend it. But I think the people who would benefit from change don't have that same sense of entitlement, and we're not quite as up in arms, I don't think, or as furious about things as perhaps we ought to be. So I think if you can bring to this election the like frustrated energy of a boomer who owns several properties and collecting franking credit tax refunds, and pretend that's all being taken away and try to bring that level of activism, I think that would really help to build more ambition.
Okay, that's well, I'll seek to channel that in my future future media appearances for the campaign, and you know, other other appearances for the campaign. Stephen, what's the last word from you on this? What do you need from a campaign like ours to build support for the changes that we need?
I'm gonna say what Joel just said, put on a tote bag, put it on a mug, put it on a t-shirt. We need critical mass. I think we need, like, for lack of a better phrase, I think we need that people to feel entitled to a better world. I think, you know, like exactly like what Joel said, there are so many people that feel they've spent a long time building the status quo in this country and a long time building the economic system that we have and the political system that we have. And they're not going to give it up without a fight. And I think, you know, we see that start to manifest in this federal election in particular, where we suddenly got all these third-party players that are now appearing around the country. Groups like Advance Australia and Australians for Prosperity, these groups that have sort of really looked at what's happened in the United States, successfully happened in the United States, with transforming the Republicans over there into this off the deep end bunch of cookers. It took them 15 years, but they eventually got there. And now they're going to try and do the exact same thing here. And it's because they see, I think it's because they see sort of two-party systems starting to fall apart. Like in the last federal election where Labor should have romped it in an absolute landslide, that didn't happen. And the crossbench tripled in size. And I think we're staring down the barrel of a federal election, at least with, well, the latest date it can be is the 17th of May, so 2 months at the absolute most until it's done, where we have a minority government almost inevitable, is what it feels like. That's at least how it's being reported on as well, where neither of the major parties are going to have a majority and may not ever have a majority ever again. And I think that actually terrifies them, and it terrifies the powers that be, and it terrifies the donors to those organizations, because their very grip on power is slipping away from them. And that is the beauty of democracy, that is the tool that we can use to actually take that power away from the status quo. And so I think that is honestly what motivates me. I think we're at a tipping point, and I know people say this every single election, but I genuinely think we are at a tipping point here, where if we can break this two-party status quo, what that opens up for the future of the country is, I think, unimaginable, because we've never had to imagine it before. And so I think we could be in a situation where, well, Parliament works better, it's more reflective of the people, but we can actually get these big, bold reforms through that we actually know the vast majority of people in this country actually want, because they tell us it's what they want. They tell us it's what they want at door knocks, at markets, at all the events we do. They tell people it's what they want in survey and poll after poll and research after research after research. And it's actually basically just providing the platform for it to finally happen. I think people can feel really, really defeated and defeatist at what is going on in the world at the moment and what's going on with politics at the moment. But if there's sort of one piece of hope that I can give people, it is that things will get better, but they are only going to get better if we all mobilize and we all rally. If you're waiting for someone else to do it, it's never going to happen. And I think that yeah, we do have to take on a little bit of personal responsibility in you know, empowering ourselves to get involved with organizations and to get involved with campaigns and to go along to your local councillor, state, federal MPs pop-up event, even if they're from a party you absolutely hate and you know that you're not maybe going to be able to change their mind overnight. But you going there and engaging with them and actually saying the things that need to be said, it at least puts in the back of their mind, oh God, a lot of people are saying this to me. Maybe I should start bringing this up in speeches, or maybe I should start bringing this up in my party room meetings. It's those little chipping away, and, you know, I can't remember the exact phrases, but squeaky wheel, yada, yada, yada. I think that actually really, really does help. But I also think from another perspective, organizations, especially in the housing sector, have such a unique opportunity in this. You are so trusted by the public, like so trusted by the public, that if organizations came out and were more critical and were openly pushing for more and more and more, I genuinely think the government would be forced to do something, because there is such a huge public trust. There's such a want in the public for huge systemic change to happen in the housing system, that I think if the public is singing from that hymn sheet, and then all the housing orgs are singing from that hymn sheet, it makes it an untenable position for the government to not do anything bold. And I think even if they try little milquetoast reforms here and there and band-aid solutions, I know we will be there calling them out, and everyone should be calling them out, because that is how we're actually going to get to a better world, is by demanding it and actually, having that little bit of entitlement that we should have a better world.
Those are fantastic closing reflections from both of you. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks to everyone who came along today. I'm so sorry that there are so many questions that we didn't get to. This happens at the end of every one of these. We've got questions about disability accessible housing, questions about manufactured and prefabricated homes, questions about zoning, all kinds of things that we just didn't have time for. So thanks to everyone for bringing us your questions. Thanks for coming along. We're finishing just a few minutes late, but I think it's been a fantastic conversation, and I think it's been a really energizing conversation as well. So for those who are interested, we are having a WA town hall tomorrow, and that's going to be our last in this series. And we've really enjoyed hearing from candidates and local members as part of this process. And thank you again to Stephen and Joel for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
Bye-bye.